Alright, so we've talked about how water moves through the soil by way of bulk flow, which remember is movement of water down a hydrostatic pressure gradient, as well as by diffusion, which is movement down a water potential gradient towards roots. So now water has basically arrived at roots, and water is going to be taken up by the roots by way, again, by way of diffusion or osmosis. In some cases, whether if it's moving through the symplast or by way of bulk flow to a certain point, if it's moving through the apoplast. But as we'll see, water ultimately has to move from the apoplast into the symplast, and these are terms that you'll become more familiar with as we move through. Now the question is, how do roots maximize water uptake from the soil? How do roots maximize water uptake? And there are a variety of ways here. We're looking here first at root structure or architecture. We can use architecture. So for example, here we're looking at a eudicot, which has a taproot system, which you might recall is effective for accessing deep water sources, deeper at least, versus a monocot plant, which has more of a fibrous root system. And the fibrous root system concentrates its root growth in a particular volume of soil that's a bit more superficial or shallow. So we'll put superficial layers. Oops. Superficial soil layers, which is, you know, water is more available in those layers right after a rain event, perhaps. So accessing those quick sources of water as they come into the system. Now, both of these are, we could also see how roots maximize water uptake based on root structure because of their habit, plant habit. So these are more herbaceous plants here that we're looking at, versus a perennial plant that we see here, for example a tree or a shrub, something that's more long-lived, living longer than at least 2 seasons. So in this case you see a variety of roots that are going to access different sources of water. So here again we have a tap root for deeper sources of water. We have these here and over here lateral roots to access some more of those shallow regions. And then we've got, coming off of lateral roots, these descending roots. So basically increasing the volume of soil that is accessed by the tree. So being a longer lived organism, a tree can respond to the locations more plastically of water supply, or other resources such as in nutrients, which are also taken up by roots. So we'll add that plus nutrients. What becomes interesting is when we compare root structure with how plants sort of evolve within a community, where different plants access different parts of the soil as a result of competition past, you know, working out those strategies so that they can coexist essentially. So in this diagram, what we're looking at is actually plants that did not evolve within the community, invasives versus native plants, native species. And so this is the native in the diagram, which is Kentucky bluegrass, and you can see all of these invasives with various deeper and more lateral root structures that are going to outcompete those natives. So there's, you know, a big shift in the community, and you can sort of discuss how that eventually will affect ecosystem functioning. So that's a big issue as plants are becoming more mobile in terms of dispersions and so forth. All right, so we move to the next slide here, where we're now looking at root uptake. You have a little space here. So root uptake occurs in what part of the plant, of the root, and why? Why is it limited to that part? So that's what we're going to focus on next. So we're looking here on the left at a longitudinal section through the root, and you might recall this here being that apical meristem where cell division is occurring, and this is our root cap, which is that several layers of dead cells that protect the meristem as the root is pushing through the soil by shedding as the tip is abraded by soil. So root uptake takes place at about 0.5 millimeters away from the root cap. And that's basically a sort of more basal than this apical meristem. So root uptake takes place mainly in this region of cell differentiation, but somewhat in this region of cell elongation. But we're going to, isolate that to the region of cell differentiation. And I'm not writing that very clearly there. Because that's where we have vascular tissue, functional vascular tissue. It is also the root hair zone. So if a plant has root hairs, then that's going to maximize root uptake as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about root hairs here. But again, that zone of cell differentiation is where there's going to be xylem. And xylem has to be present in order to transport or transfer that water up through the plant. So let's take a look, before we look at root hairs here, at why uptake is taking place here in this region, because if we look more basal to that region over here in the graph that we're seeing on the right hand lower corner here, that distance from the root apex, which is where the root cap is, uptake sort of increases along the way here, and then we see this precipitous drop. And so that might be, that's still within a zone of cell differentiation or in the more proximal parts of, towards the older sections of the root. So as the root ages, more basally located, then there's an increase in suberin content. Okay, so suberin is a compound that infiltrates the cell wall between the cellulose microfibrils, and it basically is hydrophobic. It blocks water absorption. So it's kind of like a waxy substance. And so you can see that the water is basically going to be blocked from maybe 60 to 80 millimeters from the root apex as the suberin content increases. And so the question is, why would the root do that? What would be advantages of that? Well, first of all, the suberin is creating a more sturdy or structure to the root, whereas the root tip is a little bit more softer tissue, a little more vulnerable, but that's where water can access more easily through those softer tissues, I guess, basically. But there's another important reason, which has to do with the gradient of water potential. So by having the root tips take up the water rather than the more basal regions of the root, the water potential gradient extends away from the root tips. So let's say if we draw sort of a rudimentary root here, something like that. So the root tips are have the lowest water potential, and so we'll write low water potential. And out here, away from the root tips, we have the higher water potential, and water moves down that water potential gradient. If instead, we'll write on this side, if instead these branch points were taking up water, they would have the lower water potential and the tips would have a higher water potential, meaning that the tips aren't able to maximize that water uptake. It's the branch points where all this suberin is located. So by having the water potential gradient start at the tips of the root, it allows that gradient to extend away from the root out into the soil instead of including part of the root. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about root hairs now. You can see the diagram up in the right corner over here. And many plants have root hairs. Root hairs are actually, if you can see over here, extensions of the root epidermis cell. They are not dead regions like the root cap or like our own hair is not living. They are, there's cytoplasm or protoplast that extends out into the root hair. They are something like 0.1 to 10 millimeters long on average. I'm going to write up here what we just said, that it is living and it's part of the root epidermis. Make sure you take note of that. And it basically, root hairs, we can have something like a density of 2,500 root hairs per centimeter square of root. So basically the root hairs have the advantage of increasing the absorptive surface area. Increasing surface area of absorption, which is an advantage to plants, by something like 1.5 to 20 times compared to roots without root hairs. So in the next video recording or recorded lecture, we're going to see some of the other advantages that are conveyed to plants that have root hairs, having to do with having better access to smaller diameter soil channels, and also increasing the cylinder of root soil contact. So we'll have that in the next clip, as well as how water moves radially into the soil.